An era of social change. Latino presence grows. Latinos of varied origins. In the 1960s, the Latino population grew from 3 million to 9 million Mexican Americans. It was the largest group. By 1960, almost 900,000 Puerto Ricans settled mostly in New York City. Cubans flee communism to New York City, Miami, New Jersey, Central Americas, and the Colombians. Some come to escape civil war and poverty. Latinos fight for change. The farm worker movement had begun, and Cesar Chavez helped form the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee. In 1965, grape growers do not recognize the union. Chavez sets up a boycott in 1970, and a negotiation contract was settled. Latinos fight for change. Cultural pride was huge, with Puerto Ricans and Chicanos demanded cultural recognition and better schools. The 1968 Bilingual Education Act passed, and it funded bilingual and cultural programs. The political power of Latinos increases, and they organize to help elect Latino candidates. Native Americans struggle for equality. Native Americans also seek greater autonomy. Native Americans cling to their culture and refuse assimilation. Native Americans are the poorest group, with the highest unemployment and health problems. Termination policy relocates and does not solve their problems. In 1968, President Lyndon Johnson establishes the National Council on Indian Opportunity. Voices of protest confronting the government. In 1972, the American Indian Movement leads a march in D.C. to protest treaty violations and to seek restoration of their native lands. The Bureau of Indian Affairs ends. They occupy it and destroy property. In 1973, the American Indian Movement, along with the Sioux tribe, sees Wounded Knee. They take hostages. A violent confrontation with the FBI ensued. Native American victories. The 1970 laws give tribes more control over their own affairs. In education, the 1960s and 80s courts recognize tribal lands and give financial compensation. Women fight for equality, and women in the workplace. Women were shut out of men's work, and jobs for women paid poorly. President John F. Kennedy's Presidential Commission on the Status of Women found that women were paid far less than men for doing the same job. Women were seldom promoted to management positions. Women's movement arises. The women's movement emerges, and Betty Friedan becomes a vocal leader. Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, shows women's dissatisfaction. Feminism is defined as the economic, political, social equality for men and women. The women's liberation movement is also called Women's Lib. The movement experiences gains and losses. The creation of the National Organization of Women, otherwise known as NOW, civil rights laws, and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission helped women gain more rights. In 1966, the National Organization of Women, founded by Betty Friedan and others, pressed for daycare centers and more vigorous enforcement of the EEOC. The movement experiences gains and losses. Gloria Steinem helps found the National Women's Political Caucus and publishes Ms. Magazine to promote women's issues. Movement experiences gains and losses. Legal and social gains. Gender-based distinctions were questioned, like the use of the husband's last name. The Higher Education Act bans gender discrimination if federal funding is used. That's called Title IX. And Congress expands the EEOC with more powers and gives child care tax breaks. Roe v. Wade was a 1973 Supreme Court case that ruled a woman's right to an abortion in the first trimester is legal. The movement experiences gains and losses. In 1972, Congress passes the Equal Rights Amendment, otherwise known as the ERA. But Phyllis Schlafly opposed the amendment because she thought it would lead to drafting women, it would end child support, and promote same-sex marriages. The movement experiences gains and losses. The new right emerges. Conservatives build a pro-family movement, which is later called the New Right. It focused on social, cultural, and moral problems. The New Right had a huge grassroots support base. The debate continued on family-centered issues with feminists. The movement's legacy. The movement changes. Americans defeated the Equal Rights Amendment. It only got 35 of 38 states for ratification. By 1982, the women's movement changes roles, attitudes toward career and family education. Career opportunities expand, but many women run into what is called the glass ceiling, which means they are limited in how high up they can be promoted. In 1983, women hold 3.5% of elected state offices and only 24 seats in Congress. The counterculture. Tune in, turn on, drop out. This was the phrase used by many members of the counterculture. These members were mainly white, middle-class youths that rejected traditional America. Members of the counterculture were called hippies. They felt society and its materialism, technology, and war were meaningless. They were very idealistic, and a lot of these youth left school, work, and home, and they went away to create idyllic communities of peace, love, and harmony. Counterculture, the hippie culture. This was an era of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, as well as crazy clothing. Some hippies turned to Eastern religions and meditation. Haight-Ashbury is a neighborhood in San Francisco that became the hippie capital. This is a picture of Charles Manson. He was an infamous mass murderer during this time. A changing culture. Pop art uses commercial, impersonal images from everyday life that imply that personal freedom was lost to conformist lifestyles. The movement was led by Andy Warhol. This is a photo of Andy Warhol's pop art, famous Campbell's soup can. This is another illustration of Andy Warhol's pop art. A changing culture, rock music. The Beatles were the most influential rock band, and they helped make rock mainstream. A changing culture, rock music. Woodstock was a concert in 1969, and over 400,000 hippies attended, and many of the popular bands of the time performed. A changing culture, changing attitudes. Attitudes towards sexual behavior became more casual, permissive. It was called a sexual revolution. Mass culture addresses forbidden topics like sex and explicit violence. Some think permissiveness is liberating. Others think it's a sign of moral decay. Liberal attitudes about dress, lifestyle, and behavior were adopted. A changing culture. Conservatives attacked the counterculture. Alarmed by violence on campuses and cities, the conservatives considered the counterculture values decadent. They thought the counterculture were irrational, they favored their senses, and they lacked inhibitions.